Hello friends, today we shall learn about Renaissance in France. This is the module 12 of the paper 2. By the end of this module, you would have acquaint about Renaissance in France. Understand the architectural changes in Renaissance France. The components of this module are as follows. Introduction, political scenario and Francis I. Artist, Jean Coet, circa 1485 to circa 1540. The Chateau d'Ambas, the Chateau de Blas, the Chateau de Senance, women patrons at Senance, the Chateau of Fontainebleau, the Louvre, gardens, list of artists. Introduction. French Renaissance, unlike Italian Renaissance, happened in 16th century, the last decade of the 15th century. Charles VIII returned 1496 from his conquest of Naples, accompanied by several Italian artists. This was the first time that Italian Renaissance styles appeared. The Chateau of the Layer Valley were first example and became predominant during the reign of Francis I. It is said that initially Italian decorative elements were simply superimposed on Gothic principles, of which are examples of Chateau d'Ambas, where Leonardo da Vinci spent his last years. The Chateau de Chambord, 1519 to 1536, a more elaborate marriage of Gothic structure and the Italianate ornament. This style grew in the work of Italian architects such as Sebastiano Seraglio, who was engaged after 1540 in much of the work at Chateau de Fontainebleau. By the mid-16th century, a number of highly talented French masters made their appearance, reasserted a classical style based on measure and proportion. The painter Francois Clouet developed a highly polished and sensuous style of the court portraiture, and during the last decades of the century, Germain Pilon produced sculptures that represent the highest achievement of the French Renaissance. Notable developments during the French Renaissance include the spread of humanism, early explorations of the New World, a New France by Giovanni da Verrazzano and Jacques Cartier, the development of new techniques and artistic forms in the fields of printing, architecture, painting, sculpture, music, the sciences and literature, and the elaboration of new codes of sociability, etiquettes, and discourse. Political scenario and Francis I. In the beginning of the 15th century, Armagnacs and Burgundians, two powerful political factions, war for control of France during the reign of King Charles V, 1380 and 1422. They fought against the French on the side of England in the 100 Years' War. But the King Charles VII of France throws away the English forces by 1453. The final war in 1559 allows for peace, and Francis 1515 and 1547 paves the way for Renaissance in France. Francis I, also called original Renaissance monarch, actively encouraged humanistic learning. He established Paris as his capital, making it a cultural, political and economic hub of France. At the same time, Reformation takes roots in France under the followers of John Calvin, and civil war emerges in France. But Renaissance gained momentum in France. Italian Renaissance arrived from Burgundy courts with its Flemish influences. Among the artists who came to France at his invitation were Leonardo da Vinci and Andrea del Sarto. Francis also collected paintings by great Italian masters such as Titian, Raphael and Michelangelo. The French Renaissance was at its apex during the rule of Francis I, and his son Henry II. Francis I ruled from 1515 to 1547, and Henry II ruled from 1547 to 1559. Not only did Francis support a number of major writers of the period, he was a poet himself, if not one of particular quality. Francis worked hard at improving the royal library. He appointed the great French humanist Guillaume Boudet as chief librarian and began to expand the collection. Francis employed agents in Italy looking for rare books and manuscripts. Francis employed agents in Italy looking for rare books and manuscripts, such as he had agents looking for artworks. During his reign, the size of the library greatly increased. Not only did Francis expand the library, but according to Necht, there is much evidence that he read the books he bought for it, a much rarer event in the royal annals. Francis actively encouraged the building and promotion of new structures. He continued the work of his predecessors on the Chateau d'Amboise and also started renovation on Chateau de Blois. Early in his reign, he began construction of magnificent Chateau de Chambord, inspired by the styles of Italian Renaissance and perhaps even designed by Leonardo da Vinci. Francis rebuilt the Chateau de Louvre, transforming it from a medieval fortress into a building of Renaissance splendor. Transforming it from a medieval fortress into a building of Renaissance splendor, he financed the building of a new city hall for Paris in order to have control over the building's design. He constructed the Chateau de Madrid in Bois de Boulogne and built the Chateau de Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The largest of Francis building projects was the reconstruction and expansion of the royal Chateau de Fontainebleau, which quickly became his favorite place of residence, as well as the residence of his official mistress, Anne, Duchess of Étampes. Each of Francis' projects was luxuriously decorated, both inside and out. Fontainebleau, for instance, had a gushing fountain in its courtyard where quantities of wine were mixed with the water. Artists. Francis persuaded Andrea del Sarto to make Paris his home in his later years. Flemish artist Jean Cloet and his son Francois Cloet, and Italian artist goldsmith Benvenuto Cellini, Rosso Fiorentino, Francisco Prometico, and Nicole del Avate of the first school of Fontainebleau were also prominent artists. Leonardo da Vinci painted very little in France. He brought with him his famous works Mona Lisa, Sainte Anne, and Saint Jean Baptiste, and they have remained in France after his death in the Louvre today. France has also commissioned a number of agents in Italy to procure notable works of art, ship them to France. There are a number of French artists to incredible talent in this period, including the painter Jean Fouquet of Tours, who achieved amazingly realistic portraits and remarkable illuminated manuscripts, and the sculptor Jean Guzan and Germain Pilon. Other names are Jacques Andret du Serres, Philibert Delorme, Giacomo Vennola, and Pierre Lescot. Jean Cloet. He was a favorite at the royal court because of his portrait skills. He painted a portrait of Francis I in around 1527 and modulated his features with soft shadings. Not the nervous activity of his hands, but he was also the symbol of power, shown through elaborate, puffy sleeves which dominate the large part of the portrait. Look at the detail of the material: silk, satin, velvet, gold embroidery. The Chateau d'Ambas, the open-air country house, the Italian villa, has appeared with its towers, formerly outstanding projections of the building, now incorporated into the facade. Its ground plan is formal. Most of the parts are grouped around a single court, and the main entrance facade is generally made with pillared hall, as open and inviting as possible. These were the characteristics of a typical chateau in France. The earliest Renaissance architecture in France is said to be parts of the Loire Valley Chateau d'Amboise, which King Charles VIII began to rebuild in the Italian manner from 1495. Employing for this purpose the Italian architect Domenico da Cortona, Chateau d'Amboise was built on a spur above the river Loire. The strategic qualities of the site were recognized before the medieval construction of the castle, seized in 1434 by Charles VII of France. The chateau became a favorite French kings from Louis IX to Francis I. Charles VIII decided to rebuild it extensively. Beginning in 1492, at first in the French-led Gothic flamboyant style, and then after 1495, employing two Italian mason builders, Domenico da Cortona and Fra Giocondo, who provided at Amboise some of the first Renaissance decorative motifs seen in French architecture. The names of three French builders are preserved in the documents: Colin Bayard, Guillain Senault, and Louis Armand Diard. It therefore became the first Italianate palace in France. In fact, Francis I was raised in his chateau. Leonardo da Vinci lived in here from 1415 onwards. Henry II and his wife, Catherine de' Medici, raised their children in Chateau Amboise along with Mary Stuart, the child queen of Scotland, who had been promised in marriage to the future French Francis II. Chateau d'Amboise. Chateau was the residence of various French kings and had several buildings from 13th to 17th centuries. When Francis I came to power, at the insistence of his wife Queen Claude, the chateau was renovated. Francis initiated the construction of a new wing and created one of the period's most important libraries in the castle. But after the death of his wife in 1524, he spent very little time at Blois, and the massive library was moved to the royal Chateau de Fontainebleau, where he was used to form the royal library that forms the core now of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Chateau de Senancy. The chateaux were the royal palaces of the French kings, initially built in the Gothic styles. Italian decorations began to be used. French architects soon adapted classical principles of building design as well. In 1512, Thomas Bohier, a royal tax collector, bought the castle of the Senancy on the river Cher, a tributary of the Loire. Using the piers of water mill on the river bank as part of the foundations, he and his wife erected a new Renaissance home. The plan reflects classical principles of geometric regularity and symmetry as rectangular building with rooms arranged on each side of the wide central hall. Only the library and the chapel, which are corbelled out over the water, break the line of the walls. In upper story, the builders used traditional features of the medieval castles: battlements, corner turrets, steep roofs, and dormer windows. The owners died soon after the chateau was finished in 1521, and their son gave it to Francis I, who turned it into a hunting lodge. Later, Roman-trained French Renaissance architect Philibert L'Orme designed a gallery on a bridge across the river for Catherine de' Medici, completed about 1581 and incorporating contemporary Italianate window treatments, wall molding and cornices that harmonized almost perfectly with the forms of original turreted building. Woman patronage at Senanso. Women played an important role in the patronage of arts during the Renaissance. Nowhere is their influence stronger than in the chateau of the Loire River Valley. Catherine Briconnet and her husband, Thomas Bohier, built and took care of Chateau of Senanso when Henry died in a tournament. His queen, Catherine de' Medici, appropriated the chateau for herself. Catherine, like so many in her family, a great patron of arts, added the two-story gallery to the bridge at Senanso, as well as outbuilding and additional formal gardens. When Catherine's third son became king as Henry III in 1574, she gave the chateau to his wife, Louise of Lorraine, who lived in mourning at the Chateau Senanza, after Henry III was assassinated in 1589. She wore only white and covered the windows, the furniture in her room with black velvet and damask. In the 18th and 19th century, the ladies continued to determine the fate of Senanza. During the French Revolution, the honor Madame Dupin was so beloved by the villagers that they protected her and saved her home. Then in 1864, Madame Pelouse bought Senanza and restored it by removing Catherine de Medici's Italian improvements. The Chateau de Fontainebleau. The reconstruction of the chateau was greatest and biggest projects of Francis I. It was the residence of French monarchs from Louis VII through Napoleon III. The architect Gilles Le Breton was invited to build the palace. He preserved the old medieval donjon where the king's apartments were located, but incorporated it into a new Renaissance style cour ovale or oval courtyard, built on the foundations of the old castle. It included monumental Porte Dorée as its southern entrance, as well as a monumental Renaissance staircase. The portkey, the Seraglio, to give access to royal apartments on the north side. This established an Italianate tradition of mannerism in painting and interior design that spread to other centers in France and into the Netherlands. The architect Sebastiano Seraglio from Italy and the Florentine Mannerist painter Giovanni Battista di Jacopo, known as Rosso Fiorentino, were invited to decorate the new gallery. Between 1533 and 1539, Fiorentino painted murals glorifying the king, framed in stucco, ornament in high relief, and lamberts sculpted by the furniture maker Francisco Cibic de Carpi. After he died, Primeteccio from Polonia, known as Pramintaich, joined later in decoration of the palace. This style of decoration became known as the first school of Fontainebleau. This was the first decorated gallery built in France. Broadly speaking, at the Fontainebleau, the Renaissance was introduced to France. He also commissioned and imported a large number of copies and casts of original Roman sculpture. These works provided an invaluable visual resource of figures and techniques for the Northern European artists. The modernization of the Louvre began in 1546 when the west wing of the square court was replaced by architect Pierre Lescot, working with sculptor Jean Goujon. The building incorporated Renaissance ideals of balance and regularity with classical architectural details and rich sculptural decoration. Gardens. In Italy, Alberti had employed the geometric principle of Vitruvius to build gardens. According to him, the house should overlook the garden and that each garden should have a portico for shade, creepers that grew over marble columns, and vases and statues that complement the garden architecture. At the Chateau d'Arblay, gardens were built, 3 terraces of different levels bordered by the old walls. At Chateau d'Amboise, Gallion and Marie, gardens were also built on various terraces and had various parterres of flowers, along with the fruits and vegetable trees. The parterres centered on fountain are more normal and have water features, often based on Italian models. These gardens were palaces for relaxation, for music and dance, for poetry and learning, for horticulture as symbolic spaces for myth and allegory, and finally as decorative motifs. French gardens have the following characteristics. The focus of garden tends to be the house, usually a palace or chateau, and paths radiate out of this, creating long axial views. A geometric plan is used and symmetry is very important. A central axis leads away from the house, perpendicular to the house. Paths tend to be gravel and edged with clipped hedges and topiary laid out in symmetrical patterns. The water is often a key feature of French garden design, and lots of round pools, long rectangles of water will be incorporated. The reflection of water adding to symmetry and tranquility of the scene. Fountains and cascades are also very common features. Close to the house, planting is kept low, no trees, and tends to consist of parterres. Parterres close to the house can be quite intricately patterned and will tend to become more simple further from the house. Further from the house, paths are often edged with trees. These are almost always manipulated in some way. Trees are always planted in straight lines, adding perspective, reinforcing the symmetry of the garden. Statuary is often used in French garden design. Pavilions and folies are often incorporated too. In the great French formal gardens, there is almost always a terrace from where the garden and its symmetry can be seen from above. I have you with a list of French Renaissance artists. Feel free to have a look at their works on your own.